The sound of distant bells drifted over the morning mist before the first raven took flight. Welcome, friends. Come a little closer and let the road unfold beneath your feet, where cold winds carry old whispers and every quiet village hides memories the great castles choose to forget. Some tales begin with the clash of swords, but this one begins with ash upon the breeze and silence where laughter once lived. Walk carefully now and listen well, for the fire has already been lit. The first village burned 3 nights after the king's feast, when the moon was thin and the fields of the crownlands lay silver beneath frost. It was called Harlaw's Bend, though no Harlaw had held it in living memory, and it stood beside a slow brown stream where women washed wool and boys trapped eels among the reeds. By dawn there was no village, only blackened posts, cracked stones, and ash drifting over the water like gray snow. No horn had sounded from the watchtower. No rider had come screaming down the King's Road. The fire had taken roofs, barns, sept, stables, and men in their beds so swiftly that the dead were found curled beneath fallen beams, hands raised as if shielding themselves from a dragon's breath. Yet no dragon had been seen. That was the first thing the survivors swore, and they swore it again when gold cloaks questioned them, and again when a master from King's Landing set down their words with ink-stained fingers. No shadow had crossed the stars. No roar had shaken the earth. No great wings had beaten the smoke flat against the ground. Old Eddard Pyle, who had lost 2 sons and half his face to the flames, spat blood into the dirt and said the fire had come from nowhere at all. The sky was clear, he rasped, staring at the ruins as though the answer still hid there. Then the air turned hot and the thatch began to burn from the inside. By the time word reached the Red Keep, 2 more hamlets had gone the same way. Small places, easily forgotten by high lords, but not by the king's tax collectors, who knew every acre that yielded barley, turnips, or boys old enough for spear practice. At court, the matter first seemed no more than a grim mischance, some madness of wildfire smugglers or kiln fires spreading in the wind. But the second village had burned in rain, and the third had burned without setting the surrounding woods alight. That was when whispers began to move beneath the painted ceilings and along the torch-lit galleries. In the kitchens, they said, the dead of Valyria had stirred. In the stables, they said, Prince Daemon had enemies who knew strange arts. In the sept, they muttered that dragons were never meant to live among men. King Viserys heard the reports from his iron throne with a face gone weary and pale beneath his crown. He was not an old man, yet pain had laid its hand upon him, and every step he took seemed to cost him more than pride would allow him to show. Around him stood the powers of the realm. Lord Lionel Strong, with his grave eyes, Sir Otto Hightower, smooth as polished stone, Grand Maester Mellos, smelling faintly of herbs and old vellum, and knights in white cloaks, whose armor shone brighter than the morning beyond the high windows. The king tapped one swollen finger upon the arm of the throne and listened while each man offered causes, doubts, and cautions. When the word dragon was spoken aloud, silence gathered in the hall like smoke under a roof. There was no dragon, said Sir Harold Westerling at last, his voice level and hard. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard had seen men lie, fear lie, and grief lie, but he did not speak as a man eager to be believed. The villagers watched the sky, because every child in the Crownlands knows to watch the sky when fire comes. Fire. They saw nothing. His hand rested near the pommel of his sword, not from threat, but from habit, as if truth itself might need defending. Whatever burned those villages, your grace, it walked, or was carried by men. Across the hall, Prince Aemond Targaryen stood half in shadow beneath a pillar carved with dragon wings. He was 10 years old, slight, sharp-faced, and still without a dragon of his own, which in the Red Keep was a wound no one needed to name for it to bleed. His older brother Aegon had Sunfire, beautiful and golden, and Princess Rhaenyra's sons had their hatchlings, noisy little beasts that snapped and smoked in the yards. Aemond had only his studies, his sword drills, and the cold knowledge that servants lowered their eyes when he passed. He listened as grown men spoke of hidden fire, and inside him something tightened, not fear exactly, but hunger, wearing fear's cloak. If there was danger in the realm, then there was also a road by which a prince might prove he was more than a boy left behind. Sir Otto noticed him watching. The hand's glance was brief, but sharp enough to cut thread. "Your Grace," he said, turning back to the king, "rumor is already riding faster than any raven. If folk begin to believe the royal dragons are loose upon them, we shall have panic in the Crownlands before week's end. This must be answered swiftly and with royal authority." He spoke gently, but everyone in the hall knew there was iron beneath the velvet. "Send men the small folk will trust, and men the lords will fear to obstruct." Viserys rubbed his brow, and the jewels of his rings flashed dully in the gray morning light. "I will not have soldiers trampling half the Crownlands in search of ghosts," he said. "Nor will I have some hedge-tale of Valyrian curses thrown back at my house by every drunken singer from here to Duskendale." His gaze moved from Sir Harold to Grand Master Mellos, then to the carved doors, beyond which courtiers waited with sharpened ears. A small party then. Quiet but not weak. They will see what has happened, find who is responsible, and end this before fear does more harm than fire. Aemon stepped forward before caution could seize him. The sound of his boots was small in that vast hall, yet it carried. "Let me go, your grace," he said, bowing with all the dignity he could gather. He felt eyes turn upon him, some surprised, some amused, and one or two openly disapproving. Heat rose in his cheeks, but he held his chin still. If the people fear House Targaryen, then a son of House Targaryen should stand before them and show that we are not the danger. I can ride, I can read tracks well enough, and I will obey the Lord Commander in all things. For a moment no one spoke, and the throne seemed taller than any mountain in the world. Viserys looked at the boy, and something like sorrow passed across his face, swift and private. He had loved peace all his life, and yet peace was forever asking payment from his children. "You are young," the king said, not unkindly. "This is not a hunt arranged for sport." Aemon swallowed the answer that came first, for it was bitter and would have betrayed him. Instead, he bowed his head and said, "Then I will learn what true danger is, father." The words struck more deeply than he expected. Viserys leaned back, and the blades of the throne caught the light behind him like frozen flame. Sir Otto watched without blinking, while Sir Harold's mouth tightened in a way that might have meant refusal or respect. At last the king sighed, and in that sigh Aemond heard both permission and regret. "You will go under Sir Harold's command," Viserys said. "You will not leave his sight without his leave. You will carry no royal banner until he judges it wise, and you will remember every hour that courage is not the same as reaching for glory." By noon the party was chosen. Sir Harold Westerling would lead it, with 6 mounted men from the Red Keep and 2 gold cloaks who knew the lanes beyond the city. Grand Maester Mellos, too old for the road and too valuable to risk, sent in his place Maester Clay, a younger man with quick hands, restless eyes, and a chain that bore more links of bronze and Valyrian steel than most maesters earned in twice his years. The last edition arrived from the river gate under guard, though he wore no chains. A lean bastard tracker named Tom Rivers, taken months before for poaching deer in a lord's wood, and spared because he could follow a hare over stone after rain. He looked at the prince once, at the white cloaks twice, and at the horses, with the careful sorrow of a man judging which one would throw him. Aemon found him in the yard while squires tightened girths and servants packed bread, salt beef, lamp oil, rope, and wool cloaks against the wet cold. "You are the tracker?" the prince asked, trying to make his voice older than it was. Tom Rivers bowed badly, as if his back had never learned the shape expected by courts. "So they tell me, my prince," he said, rubbing a thumb over a scar at his jaw. His eyes were gray-green, watchful and plain. "Though tracks are honest things, men are the trouble. You—" Before Aemon could answer, a horn sounded from the gatehouse, and ravens burst from a tower roof in a black scatter. Sir Harold mounted with the ease of a man born to saddle and sword, then looked down at the prince. "Remember what the king commanded," he said. "You are here to see, to listen, and to live long enough to tell the truth." Aemon took the reins of his horse and looked toward the road beyond the Red Keep, where the city smoke lay low over roofs, and the world waited in colors of mud, iron, and ash. Somewhere out there, villages had burned without dragons, and someone had made the realm whisper the Targaryen name with fear. He set his foot in the stirrup and climbed. The company rode out through the river gate beneath a sky the color of worn steel, while the bells of King's Landing drifted faintly behind them. The city was already awake, its narrow streets crowded with fishwives, drovers, and apprentices carrying baskets of bread, still warm from the ovens. Few paid the riders much heed until they caught sight of the white cloaks surrounding the young prince. Then voices lowered, heads bowed, and curious eyes lingered long after the horses had passed. Aemon kept his back straight in the saddle, though he felt every glance settle upon him like another piece of armor he had not chosen to wear. The King's Road stretched north through damp fields where winter wheat bent beneath the morning wind. Farmers paused beside their plows as the riders passed, and shepherds gathered their flocks close without quite knowing why. Rumors always outran horses, and these lands had already begun to feed upon frightened stories. At one lonely crossroads, an old woman carrying kindling crossed herself in the manner of the faith and whispered a prayer before looking up at the empty sky. Aemon followed her gaze, searching the clouds out of habit. There was nothing there except pale light and circling crows. Tom Rivers rode near the rear of the column with the easy balance of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than under a roof. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, yet his eyes never rested. They wandered over hedgerows, broken fences, muddy wheel ruts, and distant tree lines with quiet purpose. Every so often he would turn in the saddle to study the road behind them, as though expecting someone to follow. Emond noticed the habit but said nothing, wondering whether the tracker had enemies or merely trusted no road to remain empty for long. By midday they stopped beside a shallow brook to water the horses. The men unpacked hard cheese, dried apples, and dark bread, while Maester Clay crouched near the stream, washing ink from his fingers. Though younger than most Meisters Aemond had met, Clay carried himself with unusual reserve. His chain glimmered beneath a heavy wool cloak, and among its many links, the prince noticed 2 of dark Valyrian steel, rare enough to catch any educated eye. "You have studied the freehold," Aemond observed while kneeling beside him. Clay looked up with faint surprise before allowing himself a weary smile. "A little, my prince. Enough to know that half the tales told of old Valyria are lies, and the other half are dangerous because they contain just enough truth." He scooped cold water into his hands and rinsed his face before continuing. "Fire obeyed the dragon lords because they understood it better than other men, but they did not command every flame beneath the heavens. Too many hear the word Valyria and imagine sorcery, where a clever murderer would suffice." His tone was calm, yet something in his expression suggested memories he preferred not to revisit. "You do not believe dragons are responsible?" Aemond said. "I believe evidence before stories," Clay answered. "If a dragon had destroyed 3 villages, we would find claw marks, crushed walls, shattered trees, and scorched earth stretching for hundreds of yards. Fire alone proves nothing. Men have burned each other long before dragons crossed the narrow sea." He stood, wiping his hands dry on his sleeves. "Still, whoever did this wishes people to think otherwise, and that is what troubles me most." Sir Harold gave the order to ride before the conversation could continue. The afternoon grew colder, and low clouds gathered until even the distant hills seemed wrapped in smoke. They left the King's Road for a narrower lane bordered by ancient oaks whose bare branches twisted together overhead. Moss-covered broken stones half buried beneath roots, the remains of forgotten walls from kingdoms that had vanished centuries before the dragons came to Westeros. The silence beneath those trees felt heavy enough that even the horses snorted uneasily. Near sunset, Tom suddenly raised a gloved hand. The column halted at once, and every rider reached instinctively for sword or spear. Tom dismounted without a word and crouched beside the muddy verge where wagon tracks crossed the road. He ran 2 fingers lightly across the earth, then studied a broken branch no thicker than a child's wrist. His eyes narrowed, and he slowly walked toward the trees. Sir Harold followed on foot, while Aemond watched from the saddle, struggling against the urge to ride after them. After several tense moments, the tracker returned, carrying an arrow between 2 fingers. Its shaft was blackened near the head, though not by ordinary fire. The wood itself seemed strangely blistered, as though exposed to impossible heat without being consumed. Tom handed it to the King's Guard. "Someone watched this road yesterday," he said quietly. 3 men at least. They camped over there, covered their fire before dawn, then rode east. One left this behind." Sir Harold turned the arrow slowly in his hand. "Hunters?" Tom shook his head. Hunters do not scrape horseshoes to hide where they've ridden, nor do they climb trees for a better view of the road. He pointed toward a thick oak whose bark bore fresh scratches high above the ground. Someone was waiting for travelers. Whether they found what they wanted, I cannot say. The company pressed onward with greater caution, reaching Harlaw's Bend just as darkness swallowed the last light from the western sky. No voices greeted them, no dogs barked from cottages. The village stood exactly as the reports had described, yet no written account had prepared Aemond for the smell. Ash still drifted whenever the wind stirred, carrying with it the bitter scent of burned timber, damp earth, and something far worse that lingered beneath both. Death had a way of refusing to leave even after the flames had passed. The prince dismounted in silence. The houses had collapsed inward, leaving only black chimneys rising like broken fingers from the ground. Pots lay fused into lumps beside cold hearths. A child's carved wooden horse rested untouched in the middle of the lane, its painted wheels somehow spared, while every nearby building had burned to charcoal. Aemond bent to pick it up, turning it over in his hands before carefully setting it upon a stone wall that no longer supported a house. For reasons he could not explain, that simple toy disturbed him more than the ruined buildings. Maester Clay moved slowly among the remains with a lantern, stopping often to kneel beside melted iron or scorched stone. He examined everything with patient precision, making careful notes upon parchment despite the fading light. At one ruined cottage he frowned deeply and beckoned Sir Harold closer. The King's Guard crouched beside him, while the others gathered in uneasy silence. "The wall should have fallen outward," Clay murmured, brushing soot from a cracked foundation. Instead, they collapsed inward almost at once. Harold studied the blackened stones. "What does that tell you?" "That the fire began inside every structure at nearly the same moment." Clay looked around the village with growing concern. Not one house spread the blaze to another. Each became its own furnace, that is, unnatural. Night settled fully over Harlaw's Bend, and campfires were lit well beyond the ruined cottages, for none of the men wished to sleep among the dead. Horses stamped nervously despite the calm air, their ears twitching toward the empty village as though hearing sounds beyond human hearing. The soldiers spoke in hushed voices while cooking a thin stew, never laughing, never straying far from the firelight. Even Tom Rivers, who had crossed battlefields and forests where wolves hunted freely, remained unusually quiet. Aemond sat awake long after the others had wrapped themselves in blankets. The ruined village lay only a short distance away, its shattered chimneys standing against the stars like silent sentries. He told himself the cold alone had awakened him, yet something else tugged at the edge of his thoughts. At first he heard only the wind moving through burned beams. Then another sound reached him, so faint he wondered whether he imagined it. It was the distant rhythm of hammer striking metal. Once. Then again. Slow, measured, patient. The sound drifted across the blackened village before fading into the night, leaving only silence behind. Sir Harold was already awake, one hand resting upon his sword, staring into the darkness from which the noise had come. Neither man spoke. Both understood that no forge remained standing in Harlaw's Bend, and no living smith should have been working among its ashes after midnight. The sound did not come again that night, yet no one slept deeply after hearing it. Every creak of cooling timber drew wandering hands towards sword hilts, and every gust of wind seemed to carry the promise of footsteps just beyond the ring of firelight. Sir Harold ordered 2 men to stand watch together rather than alone, a quiet admission that even seasoned soldiers disliked what they could not explain. Emond wrapped his cloak tighter around his shoulders and stared toward the black silhouette of the ruined village until his eyes watered from the smoke. At last exhaustion overcame vigilance, and he drifted into a shallow sleep filled with dreams of empty houses whose windows glowed red from within. Dawn arrived beneath a blanket of low mist that clung stubbornly to the ground. Ash and frost had mingled during the night, turning the village lanes pale as old bone. The camp stirred without the usual grumbling, for the place seemed to swallow ordinary sounds. Horses snorted and pawed at the earth, eager to leave, while ravens gathered upon the scorched chimneys in unnatural numbers. They watched the men with bright black eyes, but made no cries, as though waiting for something that had not yet happened. Sir Harold divided the company into pairs before entering the ruins. No one was to wander beyond shouting distance, and every discovery, however small, was to be reported at once. If men did this, he reminded them, they may return to see what remains. His calm voice steadied the soldiers, though it did little to ease the unease creeping beneath their armor. Emond found himself assigned to Tom Rivers and accepted the decision without complaint. If anyone could read the silent story written across burned ground, it was the bastard tracker. They walked first through what had once been the village square. The well still stood untouched, its stone rim blackened but unbroken, and the wooden bucket hung exactly where someone had left it. Tom knelt beside the edge, studying the damp soil around the base. He brushed away loose ash with careful fingers until faint impressions emerged beneath. Boots, he murmured, several pairs. Not villagers. These came after the fire. He followed the prints for several paces before they vanished where the earth hardened beneath broken stone. Emond crouched beside him. How can you tell? The dead do not walk in neat lines. Tom glanced up briefly before returning to the tracks. The villagers ran in every direction. These men moved together, slow and deliberate. After the ground had cooled enough to cross, he pressed 2 fingers into one shallow print. Heavy boots. Good leather. Soldiers or men wealthy enough to dress like them. He stood, dusting ash from his hands. Whoever came here was looking for something. The trail led toward the ruined sept, whose roof had long since collapsed into a mound of charred beams. The carved image of the 7 above the entrance had cracked in half from the heat, leaving only the stern face of the father watching over the destruction. Inside, melted candle holders lay scattered among fallen stones, and broken fragments of colored glass glittered beneath layers of soot. Meister Clay was already there, examining the altar with an expression of growing concentration. He scarcely noticed their approach until Tom cleared his throat. I have found something stranger than melted stone, Clay said quietly. He pointed toward the center of the ruined floor, where the ash had been disturbed in a nearly perfect circle. The ring was no wider than a wagon wheel, and within it the ground had been swept clean, revealing smooth flagstones untouched by fire. Someone removed whatever stood here. The altar? Aemond asked. Clay shook his head. No, the altar remains exactly where it should. Whatever was taken stood beside it. He knelt and brushed soot from a narrow groove cut into the stone. Something narrow. Iron, perhaps, or bronze. It was fixed here for years before being removed after the fire. Tom's gaze wandered across the shattered walls. If they risked returning, it was important. Important enough to kill for, Clay replied. Before either man could answer, one of the soldiers shouted from beyond the village. The cry echoed sharply through the silent ruins, sending ravens exploding into the sky. Sir Harold reached the source first, sword already drawn, while the others hurried after him. Beyond the last cottage stood an abandoned orchard where blackened apple trees twisted like skeletal hands. At its edge lay the body of a man half hidden beneath fallen branches. He had not died in the fire. His cloak was travel-stained rather than burned, and frost still covered his beard. The corpse rested on its back, with both hands clasped over its chest. Between those hands lay a dagger of plain steel, driven through the heart with brutal precision. There was no blood upon the blade, only a thin crust of dried ash. A leather satchel remained slung across the dead man's shoulder, untouched by thieves. Sir Harold removed it carefully before opening the flap. Inside were several rolls of parchment, a wax tablet, dried food, and a small wooden tube sealed with red wax. The Kingsguard broke the seal. Within the tube rested a tightly folded map of the Crownlands marked with careful ink. Most villages appeared exactly where they should, but 6 names had been circled in dark red. 3 had already burned. 3 remained untouched. Beside the final village, someone had written a single word in a hurried hand. Next, no signature appeared anywhere upon the parchment. No crest. No clue beyond the handwriting itself. Sir Harold folded the map slowly. His face revealed little, yet Aemond saw tension gather around his eyes. Whoever carried this intended to warn someone, he said, or report to someone. He looked down at the dead messenger. Instead, he was silenced. Maester Clay examined the body with practiced care. There were no defensive wounds upon the arms, no bruises from struggle, and no sign the man had expected an attack. He trusted his killer, the Maester concluded after a time. The blade entered cleanly between the ribs. He was standing still. Clay paused as his fingers found something sewn into the lining of the dead man's cloak. Carefully, he drew out a small piece of black cloth no larger than a man's palm. At first it seemed ordinary. Then he turned it toward the light. Fine silver thread had been stitched into one corner, forming the unmistakable outline of a 3-headed dragon. The work was exquisite, the sort performed only by skilled hands serving noble households. Yet no banner or tunic bore such a fragment alone. It had been cut away from something larger, hidden inside the messenger's cloak as though too dangerous to carry openly. Aemond felt his stomach tighten. "The royal house?" one soldier whispered. Sir Harold's voice became cold enough to silence further speculation. No one repeats what has been found here until the king himself hears it. Do I make myself understood? Every man nodded immediately. The Kingsguard looked once more at the cloth before folding it into his gauntlet. A dragon sewn in silver proves nothing by itself. It may have been planted to deceive us as easily as carried in loyalty. Tom Rivers had wandered several paces beyond the body. He knelt again, studying the damp earth beneath the orchard trees. Unlike before, he remained silent for a long while. Finally, he stood and looked toward the eastern hills, where the morning mist still clung to the valleys. "We're not alone," he said. Sir Harold turned sharply. "How many?" "At least 4 riders." Tom pointed toward a line of faint hoof prints, barely visible beneath fallen leaves. "Fresh. Less than an hour old. They stopped long enough to watch us find the body." His weathered face hardened as he traced the trail disappearing into the trees. Then they rode east. A cold wind swept through the burned orchard, carrying with it the smell of wet ash and distant pine. Somewhere beyond those hills, unseen horsemen already knew the king's investigators had uncovered the dead messenger and the marked map. Whoever had planned the burnings was no longer waiting for news. They were watching every move. Sir Harold wasted no time. He ordered the dead messenger wrapped in a wool blanket and lashed across a pack horse, for the man would be buried only after his identity had been discovered. The map and the fragment of embroidered cloth disappeared into the Lord Commander's saddlebag, where they would remain under his own seal until they reached the king. No one objected. Even the oldest soldiers understood that secrets could kill as surely as sharpened steel when dragons ruled the realm. As the company mounted, Sir Harold cast one long look over the ruins of Harlaw's Bend, committing every broken chimney and every scorched wall to memory before turning his horse east. The trail left by the unknown riders proved difficult to follow. During the night, a light rain had softened the ground, but the rising sun had already begun to dry the open fields while the woods remained damp beneath their canopy. Tom Rivers rode ahead with his eyes fixed upon the earth, sometimes guiding the company without hesitation, sometimes dismounting to inspect little more than crushed moss or a snapped twig. To Aemond, the signs seemed invisible, yet the tracker read them as another man might read a letter. 4 horses, Tom muttered more than once. One shod recently, another favoring the left foreleg. They know enough to hide their passage, but not enough to fool the land itself. By noon, the trail climbed into low wooded hills, where the trees grew older and the road dwindled into little more than a hunter's path. The branches knitted together overhead until daylight filtered through in pale green shafts. The forest smelled of wet bark, fallen leaves, and rich black earth disturbed by rooting boars. Birds sang only now and then, leaving long stretches where the only sounds were leather creaking, hooves sinking into soft ground, and the distant tapping of a woodpecker. Aemond found the silence oppressive. It reminded him too much of the burned village. Maester Clay urged his horse alongside the prince. "You are watching the trees rather than the road," he observed quietly. "I dislike not knowing who watches us." "That is a sensible fear." Clay adjusted the satchel hanging across his shoulder. "Most men worry only about the enemy they can see." Aemond glanced toward him. "Do you think they mean to kill us?" "I think," the maester replied after a thoughtful pause, "that they hoped we would find nothing. Since we have already found more than they expected, they must decide whether silence is still possible. Men who build conspiracies seldom welcome witnesses." The path descended into a narrow valley where an abandoned watchtower overlooked a stream. Little remained of the structure beyond its lower walls, for ivy had claimed the stone and young trees had rooted where soldiers once kept watch. Tom signaled another halt and slipped from his saddle without a sound. He disappeared among the ruins while the others waited with growing impatience. Several minutes passed before he returned carrying a small leather pouch. He held it carefully between two fingers, as though it might contain a viper. It was hidden beneath loose stones, he said. Sir Harold accepted the pouch and loosened its drawstring. Inside lay silver stags, enough to pay 12 common laborers for a season's work. The coins were clean despite the damp earth, and beneath them rested a narrow strip of folded parchment. Harold unfolded it slowly. No names appeared upon it. Only a single sentence had been written in neat black ink. The 4th village before the full moon. No seal marked the message, and no handwriting matched the map found beside the dead messenger. Whoever had written these words had taken care to disguise every flourish of the pen. Sir Harold passed the parchment to Maester Clay, who studied it with narrowed eyes. "This was left deliberately," Clay said, "not lost." Tom nodded once. "Someone expected another rider to collect it." "Then we arrived first," Harold answered. A faint smile touched the tracker's weathered face before vanishing again. "Not first enough." He pointed toward the muddy bank beside the stream. Fresh hoof prints crossed the shallow water before disappearing into the northern woods. Unlike the careful trail they had followed all morning, these riders had made no effort to conceal themselves. It was almost as though they wished to be seen. "They're drawing us somewhere," one of the soldiers muttered. Sir Harold did not dismiss the thought. He studied the crossing for several moments before speaking. "Perhaps. Yet if we ignore the trail, we abandon the only path leading toward those responsible." He turned in the saddle and looked over each member of the company in turn. "We proceed together. No one rides ahead alone. If arrows fly, shields first, swords second." The stream proved shallow, but the northern bank rose steeply beneath tangled roots and thorn bushes. As the company climbed the slope, Tom suddenly raised a clenched fist. Every horse stopped. The forest had changed. There were no birds now. No squirrels darting among branches. Even the wind seemed strangely absent beneath the heavy canopy. Tom crouched beside a patch of flattened ferns. His fingers brushed the leaves before lifting a length of horsehair caught upon a thorn. "They're close," he whispered. "Very close." The words had scarcely left his mouth when an arrow hissed through the trees. It struck one of the pack horses high in the neck. The animal screamed, reared violently, and crashed sideways into the undergrowth. Before anyone could react, 3 more arrows flew from different directions. One shattered against a shield. Another buried itself in a tree trunk inches from Eamon's shoulder. The 3rd grazed a soldier's arm, slicing through mail links before disappearing into the brush beyond. "Shields!" Sir Harold roared. The white cloak leaped from his horse in a single smooth motion, dragging Eamon down beside him just as another volley rattled through the branches overhead. The soldiers formed a rough circle around the prince and the Meister while searching desperately for targets they could not see. Every arrow came from a different angle, then silence followed before the next attack. "They want confusion," Harold said through clenched teeth. Tom was already moving. Instead of sheltering behind the shields, he slipped into the trees with astonishing speed, vanishing among trunks blackened by age. Eamon caught only brief glimpses of him between branches before he disappeared completely. Moments later, a sharp cry rang out somewhere uphill, followed by the unmistakable clash of steel. "Stay here," Harold ordered. Eamon obeyed for perhaps 3 heartbeats. Then another cry echoed through the forest, this one cut short by a sickening thud. Against every command he had been given, the prince seized his sword and darted after the sound before anyone could stop him. Branches whipped across his face as he ran uphill through ferns and roots, slick with damp moss. Behind him, Sir Harold shouted his name, but the words faded beneath the pounding of his own heartbeat. He burst into a small clearing just as Tom Rivers wrestled a hooded archer to the ground. The struggle lasted only an instant. Tom drove his elbow into the man's throat, tore away the bow, and pinned him with a hunting knife at his neck. The archer's companions had already fled, crashing through the undergrowth toward waiting horses. Hoofbeats thundered briefly in the distance before dissolving into the forest. The captured man did not beg. He did not curse. He merely smiled through bloodied lips. Then, before either Tom or Eamon could stop him, he bit down hard. A sharp crack echoed between his teeth. Foam gathered instantly at the corners of his mouth. Within moments, his body convulsed once, then lay perfectly still. Tom stared at the dead man in disgust. "A poisoned tooth," he said quietly. "Whoever hired these men valued silence more than loyalty." Sir Harold reached the clearing seconds later with the others close behind. His relief at seeing Eamon alive vanished almost immediately beneath anger carefully held in check. "You disobeyed a direct order." "I know." "You might have died." Eamon lowered his sword, still breathing hard. "But we have one of them." Harold looked down at the lifeless assassin. After a long silence, he answered without raising his voice. "No, Prince Aemond. We have another corpse." No one spoke while the dead assassin was searched. The forest itself seemed unwilling to disturb the silence, holding its breath beneath the bare branches as the soldiers carefully examined every fold of the man's clothing. His bow was of fine yew, stronger than those carried by common hunters, and his arrows were fletched with black goose feathers, trimmed to equal length by practiced hands. There was no purse, no ring, no token from wife or child, nothing that might tell another soul who he had been before this morning. Even the seams of his boots had been opened and stitched again, as though someone had expected them to be searched after his death. Meister Clay knelt beside the body, with an expression that grew darker the longer he looked. He pried open the man's jaw using the tip of a dagger and uncovered the remains of a hollow tooth, shattered from within. A bitter smell drifted into the cold air. "Essence of nightshade mixed with basilisk venom," he said after a cautious sniff, fast enough that no question could be asked and no confession given. He eased the jaw shut again with surprising gentleness. This was prepared long before today. These men rode knowing they might never return. Sir Harold stood with folded arms, studying the dead archer rather than the Meister. "Mercenaries?" "No," Tom Rivers answered before Clay could speak. The tracker had been wiping blood from his knife with a scrap of moss, his face as unreadable as weathered oak. "Mercenaries grumble about coin, drink too much, and flee when a fight turns sour. This one carried death in his own mouth. He glanced toward the trees where the others had escaped. That's the work of men serving a cause, or a master they fear more than dying. The Lord Commander nodded once. Then we shall assume they are disciplined. His gaze shifted toward Aemond, who had remained silent since the rebuke, and discipline is not overcome by reckless courage. There was no anger in the words now, only hard-earned certainty. Your father entrusted you to my command because he believed I would bring you home alive. Do not make a liar of me. Aemond lowered his eyes, feeling the weight of the lesson more keenly than if Harold had shouted. The company buried the assassin beneath a cairn of rough stones before moving on. There would be no prayers beyond those each man whispered privately, for no one knew which gods the dead had served. Tom marked the place with a notch cut into the trunk of a nearby beech, claiming he preferred the living to remember where the dead rested. As they rode north, the forest slowly thinned until patches of pale sunlight reached the ground once more. The relief among the soldiers was visible, though no one admitted it aloud. By late afternoon, they reached the fourth village named upon the map. Unlike Harlaw's Bend, this place still lived. Smoke curled peacefully from stone chimneys. Children chased one another through muddy lanes, and chickens scratched beneath split-rail fences. The sight drew an audible sigh from more than one rider, yet relief quickly gave way to unease as the villagers noticed the armed company approaching. Doors closed, mothers gathered children by the hand. Men carrying axes or hoes remained where they stood, watching in wary silence. The village reeve, a broad-shouldered man named Hobart, with a beard gone white from age rather than comfort, came forward to meet them. He bowed stiffly before Sir Harold, though his eyes lingered upon the prince with open curiosity. "We've heard the stories," he admitted before anyone asked. 3 villages burned. Some say dragons, others blame outlaws. He looked toward the clouded sky. "We've seen neither." "You've noticed no strangers?" Harold asked. Hobart hesitated. "Travelers come and go. A tinker last week. 2 septons before that. Traders from Rosby." His weathered brow furrowed, though there were 4 riders 3 days ago. They bought fresh horses from old Bran Miller. The reeve scratched thoughtfully at his beard. They wore plain cloaks, paid in silver without haggling, and asked many questions about the roads east. Tom exchanged a brief glance with Sir Harold. "The same 4, the tracker murmured. Hobart led them through the village toward Bran Miller's stable. The old horse breeder proved eager enough to speak, once reassured that no accusation hung over him. "Quiet fellows," Bran recalled while rubbing cracked hands together against the chill. "Well mounted already, but one horse had thrown a shoe. They paid double for fresh mounts and left the old beasts behind." He frowned toward the stable yard. "Didn't care which horses they took neither, so long as they were fast." "Where are the old horses now?" Tom asked. Bran gestured toward a fenced paddock beyond the barn. "There." The abandoned animals grazed peacefully beneath the fading afternoon light. Tom approached them slowly, studying each in turn before stopping beside a dark bay gelding. He crouched near one hoof, running a thumb over the iron shoe. A small mark had been stamped into the metal near the heel, almost too faint to notice beneath dried mud. "What is it?" Aemond asked Coral. Tom did not answer immediately. Instead, he scraped away the dirt with his knife until the stamp became clear. A crown. Not the crowned stag of House Baratheon. Not the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. A simple circlet with 7 tiny points. Maester Clay's expression sharpened the instant he saw it. "That mark belongs to the royal farriers," he said quietly. "Horses kept in the king's own service."
Bran Miller stared blankly between them. "I bought that gelding at market 2 years ago." "You may well have," Clay replied. "Royal stables sell old stock often enough. That shoe is new, less than a month old." A silence settled over the stable yard. If one of the assassins had ridden a horse freshly shod by craftsmen serving the Red Keep, coincidence had become increasingly difficult to believe. Sir Harold's face hardened. "No one speaks of this outside our company." The Reeve looked bewildered. "Have we done something wrong?" "No," Harold answered, "but someone has." As evening approached, the villagers insisted the travelers remain for supper despite the danger. Bread fresh from the oven, onion stew, thick with barley, smoked rabbit, and weak ale appeared upon rough wooden tables inside the Reeves' hall. The warmth of the hearth drove away the damp chill clinging to cloaks and boots, and for the first time since leaving King's Landing, the company found themselves surrounded by ordinary life rather than ashes. Children laughed in corners, dogs begged beneath benches. An old woman scolded her grandson for stealing honey cakes before they cooled. Aemond watched it all quietly. The simple peace unsettled him almost as much as the burned village had. These people had no walls, no garrison, no dragons to protect them. Only hope that tomorrow would resemble today. He wondered how many mornings the folk of Harlaw's Bend had believed exactly the same thing. Night settled fully outside, and one by one the villagers drifted home until only the Reeves family and the royal company remained around the fire. Rain began tapping softly against the shutters. Tom Rivers had scarcely touched his food, choosing instead to sharpen his hunting knife with slow, even strokes across a whetstone. Suddenly he stopped. His head lifted. "So did the rest of you hear that?" The hall fell silent. At first there was only rain. Then faint beneath its steady rhythm came another sound. Not hammering this time, singing. A woman's voice. Soft, clear, far too beautiful for the empty road outside. The melody floated through the darkness beyond the walls, lingering just long enough for every soul in the hall to hear, before fading into the rain once more. Old Hobart's wife turned pale. "In the mother's mercy," she whispered. "That song. No one has sung that since the night before Harlaw's Bend burned." The hall remained silent long after the last note vanished into the rain. No one reached for a bowl or a cup, and even the dogs beneath the benches had gone still, ears pricked toward the shuttered windows. The fire continued its quiet crackling, yet the warmth it offered no longer reached the people gathered around it. Hobart's wife clutched the carved 7-pointed star hanging from her neck until her knuckles whitened. She swallowed twice before finding her voice. "It was that same song," she whispered. "I heard it carried on the wind the evening before my sister's village burned." Sir Harold rose from the table without haste,
though every movement spoke of readiness. He nodded to two of his men, and together they crossed the hall to the heavy oak door. One soldier lifted the bar while the other held a lantern high, its light dancing over polished mail and wet stone. The door opened upon darkness and steady rain. Beyond the village green there was only the empty road, puddles shining beneath the moonlight that struggled through broken clouds, and the sound of water dripping from bare branches.
Whoever had sung was gone, if anyone had stood there at all. Tom Rivers stepped into the rain before anyone could stop him. He crouched immediately, holding the lantern low to the muddy ground instead of raising it ahead. His eyes moved slowly over the road, then toward the grass beside the nearest fence. He remained there for several moments before motioning Sir Harold outside. The Lord Commander joined him, careful not to disturb the earth beneath his boots. "One rider," Tom said quietly. "A horse stood here less than a minute. Whoever sat the saddle never dismounted." Harold studied the faint impressions. "How can you tell?" "The horse shifted its weight, but no second pair of prints touches the mud." Tom pointed toward the shallow marks. "See there, front hooves restless." The rider lingered only long enough to watch the hall. He followed the trail with the lantern until it disappeared into the rain-soaked road leading west. The singing came from horseback. Eamon stood beneath the doorway, listening as rain pattered softly against his cloak. If they wished to kill us, they had the chance. "They wished to frighten us instead," Meister Clay replied from behind him. "Fear often travels farther than blood." The maester looked toward the darkness with troubled eyes. "And whoever planned these burnings understands that well." The company searched the outskirts of the village until midnight, yet they found nothing beyond the rider's departing trail. No campfire glowed among the trees. No fresh footprints crossed the nearby fields. It was as though the mysterious singer had risen from the rain itself before vanishing back into it. At last, Sir Harold ordered everyone indoors. Watches were doubled, shutters barred, and horses moved into the Reeves barn where they would be less vulnerable to wandering arrows. Sleep came reluctantly to every soul beneath that roof. Eamon awoke before dawn to the muffled sound of voices. Pulling on his boots, he crossed the hall to find Tom, Rivers, and Maester Clay already studying a folded piece of parchment upon the table. Sir Harold stood over them with folded arms, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. The parchment had not been there the night before. It lay perfectly dry despite the storm that had continued until sunrise. "Where did that come from?" Eamon asked. Tom looked toward the prince without lifting his hand from the page. "Pinned to the outside of the door with a knife." He tapped the table lightly. None of the watchmen saw who left it. The message itself contained only a few carefully written words. "Leave before sunset, or burn with them." No seal marked the parchment. No signature appeared beneath the warning. The handwriting differed from every sample they had already found. Sir Harold rolled the parchment closed. "Whoever follows us knows where we sleep." His voice remained calm, though the thought behind it chilled every listener. "That means eyes inside the village, or someone watching closely enough to learn our movements before nightfall." Hobart denied any betrayal with obvious sincerity when questioned later that morning.
Every household had remained indoors during the rain, and none admitted seeing a lone rider. The reeve offered to gather every villager for inspection, but Sir Harold refused. "If there is a spy here, he has already hidden himself," the Lord Commander said. "If there is none, I will not reward fear by accusing innocent people." The decision seemed to surprise Aubert almost as much as it relieved him. After breaking their fast, the company began examining every road leading away from the village. Tom chose the western lane where the mysterious rider had departed. It wound between low hills dotted with abandoned sheepfolds and ancient standing stones worn smooth by centuries of wind. Moss covered the old markers so thickly that no carving remained visible, though local children still tied faded ribbons around them each spring for luck. The place felt older than the Seven Kingdoms themselves, as if forgotten gods still watched from beneath the earth. Near midday, Tom halted beside one of the tallest stones. He crouched, brushing away damp leaves gathered at its base, then frowned. "Someone dug here recently." His knife slipped easily into the loosened soil. Within moments, the blade struck wood. Together, the men uncovered a narrow chest, no longer than a man's arm. Its iron hinges were red with rust, yet the lock had been broken only days before. Sir Harold lifted the lid cautiously while the other stood ready for any trap. Inside rested several rolled parchments wrapped in oilcloth, a small leather ledger, and a sealed clay jar. Maester Clay examined the parchments first. They proved to be shipping records listing wagons entering and leaving King's Landing over the past 6 months. Most carried grain, timber, stone, or wool. Several, however, bore stranger entries. Barrels of lamp oil, far exceeding ordinary orders, had been delivered not to castles or towns, but to abandoned storehouses scattered across the Crownlands. The destinations matched villages already burned, as well as 2 names still untouched upon the map. "Lamp oil alone cannot do this," Clay murmured. "No," Sir Harold agreed, "but enough of it hidden beneath houses would feed a blaze beyond any common fire." Tom opened the leather ledger next. It contained columns of numbers, payments made under false names, and dates carefully spaced over nearly a year. One page had been torn free. Another contained only a single recurring mark beside every completed payment, a tiny crown with 7 points. Emond felt unease settle deeper inside him. Again that crown. Again a trail leading somehow back toward King's Landing. The clay jar proved the strangest discovery of all. Its seal had not been broken. Clay carefully scraped away the hardened wax before easing the lid aside. A sharp, acrid smell escaped at once, forcing several soldiers to step back. Inside lay a thick black substance that clung stubbornly to the sides of the vessel, gleaming faintly green whenever sunlight touched its surface. The maester's face lost all color. He replaced the lid immediately. "No fire," he said, more sharply than anyone had yet heard him speak. "No torch comes near this jar." Sir Harold looked at him closely. "You know what it is." Clay hesitated only a heartbeat. "I pray I am wrong." He drew a slow breath. "But if I am not, this is wildfire." The words settled over the company like a fresh snowfall. Even Aemond had heard enough stories to understand its meaning. Wildfire did not merely burn, it devoured. It clung to stone, water, flesh, and iron alike
until nothing remained but ruin. His father had often spoken of the terrible caches hidden beneath King's Landing by kings who had mistaken terror for strength. The substance was guarded more carefully than gold. Tom looked from the sealed jar to the ledger in silence. Then his gaze drifted toward the distant road leading back to the capital. "If wildfire is reaching these villages," he said quietly, "someone powerful is helping it leave the city. I'll need you." No one answered. For the first time since leaving the Red Keep, every man present understood that the conspiracy before them might reach far beyond nameless riders and hidden archers. It might already have roots inside the king's own household. They buried the chest once more before leaving the standing stones. Sir Harold insisted that only the ledger, the shipping records, and the sealed jar travel with them, while the empty chest was returned to the earth exactly as it had been found. "If others come looking for it," he said, pressing the last layer of damp soil flat with his boot, "let them believe nothing has changed." No one argued. The discovery of wildfire had altered the nature of their journey. They were no longer following scattered clues left by frightened conspirators. They were carrying evidence that could condemn men close to the Iron Throne. The road bent southward through rolling farmland where winter had stripped the orchards bare. Every farmhouse they passed seemed to withdraw into itself, shutters closed against the chill despite the bright afternoon. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys, and flocks grazed beneath the watch of silent shepherds. Yet the company no longer trusted peaceful appearances. Eamon found himself studying every distant rider and every wagon cresting a hill, wondering which ordinary traveler concealed a knife or a message. It troubled him how quickly suspicion had become second nature. Only days earlier, he had imagined danger as something loud and obvious. Now he understood that true danger often smiled before it struck. Tom Rivers rode beside him for much of the afternoon without speaking. At last the prince broke the silence. "You have tracked murderers before." The bastard gave a quiet nod. "Bandits, poachers, once a knight who thought his title would hide what he'd done." "Were they always this careful?" Tom considered the question. "Careful men leave fewer tracks, but they never leave none. Every living soul changes the world simply by walking through it." He looked toward the muddy verge where wagon wheels had cut deep grooves into the earth. "What worries me is not how well these people hide. It's how many hands must be helping them. One rider cannot move barrels of wildfire across half the Crownlands." As evening approached, they reached the final village named upon the map, a settlement called Brindle Heath. Unlike the others, it stood behind a stout timber palisade raised generations earlier against raiders from the sea. The gate opened only after Sir Harold identified himself, and even then the guards kept nervous hands upon their spears. Their captain, a square-faced veteran named Edric Fell, admitted them with visible relief. "You're later than we hoped," Edric said while leading them toward the village square. "A raven came from Rosby, warning us of the fires." His voice dropped lower. "We've kept watches every night since." "Have you seen strangers?" Sir Harold asked. "More than usual. Traders, pilgrims, hedge knights." Edric frowned. "Nothing that seemed worth remembering until yesterday. 4 men asked whether our grain stores stood inside the walls or beyond them. I thought them curious, but curiosity isn't a hanging offense. Tom and Harold exchanged another glance. Again, 4 men. Again, questions about the village. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. The captain led them to the grain storehouse before sunset. It was a broad timber building standing near the center of the settlement, surrounded by wagons loaded with sacks awaiting winter distribution. The place smelled of barley, straw, and fresh-cut oak. Meister Clay walked its length slowly, tapping support beams with the handle of his knife and studying the floorboards beneath the stacked grain. Halfway through the building, he stopped. There. His voice was barely above a whisper. Beneath one loose plank, the maester uncovered a narrow clay pipe leading downward into darkness. The pipe had been concealed with remarkable skill beneath packed straw and fresh timber. Tom knelt beside it, running one finger over the rim. Recently installed. Clay leaned close, careful not to touch it. It's not for water. He lifted the lantern nearer. A faint green stain marked the inside of the pipe. Wildfire. The realization struck everyone at once. Someone had hidden the substance beneath the granary itself. Sir Harold immediately ordered the building cleared. Villagers rushed inside in confusion as soldiers hurried them back out, hauling sacks of grain into the muddy square, while children cried and elders demanded explanations. None were given. Within minutes, the once orderly storehouse stood nearly empty. Only then did Tom and 2 soldiers pry away the remaining floorboards. Beneath them stretched a narrow tunnel no higher than a crouching man. Its walls had been reinforced with rough timber, and several clay jars identical to the one found beneath the standing stone rested along its length. They had been spaced carefully beneath the granary's supports, connected by woven cords soaked in oil. Maester Clay stared down in horror. "One spark," he said quietly, "and the whole village dies." No one moved for several heartbeats. The scale of the plan exceeded every fear they had imagined. This was no act of random terror. Whoever had built the tunnel intended to destroy the granary at the heart of the settlement, ensuring that burning grain and collapsing beams would spread fire to every nearby house before anyone understood what had happened. Sir Harold climbed into the tunnel himself. "Carefully," Clay warned. The King's Guard nodded. No steel against stone. Working by lantern light, Harold examined each jar without disturbing it. Several remained tightly sealed. One, however, had already been opened. A blackened fuse extended from its mouth, disappearing deeper into the darkness beyond the last support beam. Tom's expression hardened. "This tunnel goes farther." He squeezed past Harold and followed the fuse on hands and knees. The confined space smelled of damp earth and the bitter scent of wildfire. After perhaps 30 feet, the passage widened into a small chamber. Someone had lived there. A folding stool stood beside a crude wooden table. Blank parchments, sealing wax, dried meat, and empty water skins lay scattered across the floor. The ashes of a tiny cooking fire rested cold in one corner, but the chamber itself was empty. The occupant had fled only recently. Tom noticed it first. The ashes are warm. At almost the same instant, voices erupted outside. A soldier shouted, then another. Hoofbeats thundered beyond the village gate. Sir Harold emerged from the tunnel with astonishing speed, sword already drawn. the company rushed into the open square, where frightened villagers pointed toward the western fields. 4 riders were fleeing across the heath. One turned briefly in the saddle. Even at that distance, Aemon saw the flash of polished steel as the man hurled a burning brand behind him. The torch landed beside a hay wagon, abandoned near the granary wall. For one terrible instant, nothing happened. Then fire raced along the ground with impossible speed. Not through straw, not through dry grass, but through an invisible trail that blazed emerald green. Maester Clay shouted a single word. "Run!" The wildfire hidden beneath the village had found its flame. The green fire burst from the earth with a sound unlike any ordinary blaze. It did not roar at first. It hissed, almost like 1,000 serpents drawing breath together beneath the soil before erupting into towering emerald flames that consumed the hidden trail in an instant. Villagers screamed as the unnatural light flooded the square, painting frightened faces in ghostly shades of green. Horses reared against their reins, kicking wildly as panic spread faster than the fire itself. For one heartbeat, every soul stood frozen, unable to believe what their own eyes were witnessing. Sir Harold was the first to move. "To the tunnel," he thundered, his voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. "Break the line before it reaches the jars." His white cloak flashed through the smoke as he sprinted toward the opened floor beneath the granary. Soldiers followed without hesitation, seizing shovels, axes, and even loose planks in desperate hope of collapsing the passage before the wildfire reached its hidden stores. Aemon ran beside them, coughing as bitter smoke clawed at his throat. He had seen dragons from the safety of castle walls, but this was different. Dragons breathed death only where they chose. Wildfire seemed eager to devour the whole world. Tom Rivers reached the tunnel entrance first. Without waiting for orders, he leaped inside, disappearing into the darkness beneath the granary. Sir Harold cursed under his breath and followed him immediately, while 2 soldiers began tearing away support beams with heavy axes. Maester Clay dropped to his knees beside the opening, his face pale beneath the flickering green light. "Strike only the rear braces," he shouted. "If the roof falls too soon, the flames will leap over the collapse." His hands shook despite the precision of his instructions. Knowledge alone could not quiet fear when ancient alchemy came alive beneath one's feet. Inside the tunnel, the air had already grown suffocating. Tom raced toward the chamber where the opened jar rested, his boots slipping across damp earth slick with spilled oil. Behind him came Sir Harold, stooping beneath the low ceiling while dragging a fallen timber beam across the passage. The fuse burned toward them with terrifying speed, its tiny flame racing through the darkness like a living creature hunting prey. Tom seized the first unopened jar and hurled it sideways into the chamber wall. The clay shattered harmlessly, spilling thick black wildfire across cold earth where it smoldered without igniting. "Here," he shouted, "block the passage." Together they forced the heavy beam across the narrow tunnel until it jammed tightly between the walls. Harold braced his shoulder against the timber while Tom drove broken planks beneath it, creating a rough barricade. Above them, axes pounded into the granary floor. The ceiling groaned as supports splintered one by one. Dirt sifted down into their hair and eyes. Then the burning fuse reached the barricade.
The explosion hurled both men backward. The beam shattered into a storm of splinters, but the collapsing tunnel swallowed much of the blast. Earth thundered downward as the roof gave way behind them, burying the chamber beneath tons of soil and timber. Green fire surged against the collapse, forcing blazing cracks through the rubble before finally suffocating beneath its own prison. A deafening silence followed. Dust filled every breath. Tom lay half buried beneath loose earth, unable to hear anything except the ringing inside his skull. Outside, the granary shuddered but remained standing. The emerald flames burst from the tunnel entrance in a violent column before dying almost as quickly as they had appeared. Smoke rolled across the square, carrying the sharp, metallic odor that Maester Clay had dreaded from the moment he recognized the wildfire. Villagers stumbled through the haze, calling for missing children and frightened kin. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others simply stared at the scorched ground where death had nearly claimed them all. The hay wagon burned fiercely, yet compared to what might have happened, it seemed no greater than a hearth fire. Emond helped drag Sir Harold from the collapsed tunnel. The Lord Commander emerged blackened with soot. His white cloak burned through in several places, one arm bleeding where flying timber had struck him. Tom crawled out. Moments later, coughing so violently he could scarcely stand. Neither man spoke at first. They simply looked back toward the buried passage, understanding how narrowly disaster had been avoided. Maester Clay pressed trembling hands against Harold's wounded arm before turning to the tracker. "You both should be dead," he said quietly. Tom managed a tired smile. "We nearly were." "No," Clay replied. "You were exactly where you needed to be." Even as relief spread through the village, Sir Harold's attention shifted elsewhere. He looked toward the western gate where the 4 riders had vanished. "This was meant to delay us," he said, "not destroy us." His voice had regained its familiar steadiness despite the blood soaking his sleeve. They expected the granary to explode while they escaped. He glanced toward the horizon where the last traces of dust still lingered above the road. "Instead, they know we've survived." Tom's expression darkened, which means they'll warn whoever commands them. The villagers gathered around the royal party with gratitude and confusion written plainly across their faces. Hobart's counterpart in Brindle Heath, a widow named Mara who had governed the settlement since her husband's death during the spring sickness, knelt before Sir Harold, despite his repeated attempts to prevent it. Tears streaked her soot-covered cheeks as she looked over the frightened children clinging to their mothers. "You saved us," she whispered, "every one of us." Harold shook his head. "Stand, my lady. Thank the men who dug with bleeding hands before you thank me." His gaze rested briefly upon Tom, then upon the exhausted soldiers hauling debris away from the collapsed tunnel. Today the realm was spared because common men refused to yield. As darkness settled, the company established a guarded camp within the village palisade rather than sleeping beneath roofs that still smelled faintly of smoke. No one wished to test fate twice in one day. Maester Clay spent hours examining fragments recovered from the tunnel, laying them carefully upon a blanket illuminated by lantern light. Among broken planks and shattered clay, he found something unexpected: a small brass key blackened by soot, but otherwise untouched. It bore no decoration save a tiny 7-pointed crown engraved upon its bow. He turned it slowly between his fingers. "This wasn't dropped by accident," he murmured. Eamon sat beside him, watching the firelight glimmer across the metal. "A key to what?" "I don't know."
Eco. Clay slipped the key into a leather pouch and tied it securely beneath his robe. But whoever built that tunnel thought it worth carrying. Near midnight, when the camp had finally grown quiet, Tom Rivers woke without knowing why. Years spent sleeping beneath open skies had taught him to trust instincts he could not explain. He rose silently and moved beyond the nearest wagons, listening to the gentle breathing of horses inside the palisade. At first, everything appeared peaceful. Then he noticed one horse standing perfectly still, ears fixed toward the eastern darkness beyond the walls. A heartbeat later came the sound. Not singing, not hammering. A raven's harsh cry echoed once from somewhere outside the village. It was answered immediately by another, then another. Tom frowned. Ravens did not call to one another in the dead of night, unless someone was using them as a signal. Tom Rivers slipped between the sleeping wagons without waking a single man. The cold night air carried the smell of damp earth and lingering smoke from the scorched granary, but beneath those familiar scents he caught another fainter one. Horse sweat, fresh leather, men waiting in silence. He rested one hand against the rough timber of the palisade and listened again.
The ravens had fallen quiet, yet the stillness beyond the walls felt unnatural, as though too many living things had suddenly decided not to make a sound. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his knife. Rather than raising the alarm immediately, Tom climbed the nearest watch platform where one of the village guards stood, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The young man pointed uncertainly toward the eastern fields. "They cried from over there," he whispered. "3 birds, maybe 4. Tom accepted the guard's spyglass and swept the moonlit countryside slowly from north to south. At first, he saw only pale grass bending beneath the wind. Then a brief flash answered the moonlight. Metal. Someone below had shifted carelessly, allowing steel to catch the light for the smallest fraction of a heartbeat. Tom lowered the glass at once. "They're closer than I hoped." The warning reached Sir Harold before panic reached the villagers. The Lord Commander roused his soldiers with quiet efficiency, keeping voices low so that the enemy would not know they had been discovered. Armor was buckled in darkness. Shields were lifted without clatter. Eamon awoke to find Harold fastening the last strap of his breastplate while Maester Clay carefully packed the ledger, the shipping records, the brass key, and the sealed jar into separate saddlebags. The prince needed no explanation. He saw it written plainly across every face. Whoever watched them outside the walls had come for the evidence. No attack followed. An hour passed, then another. The eastern horizon slowly lightened from black to deep blue, while frost settled across the fields. Soldiers shifted stiffly behind the palisade, weary from waiting for an assault that refused to begin. Eamon found the silence more difficult to endure than open battle would have been. Every heartbeat seemed stretched thin by expectation. At last he turned toward Sir Harold. "Why don't they strike?" "Because they are counting," Harold replied without taking his eyes from the gate. "Counting what?" "Our patience." The answer proved wiser than Eamon understood.
Just after sunrise, a frightened rider appeared on the northern road, waving a torn strip of white cloth above his head. His horse stumbled with exhaustion, foam hanging from its mouth while its rider swayed weakly in the saddle. The village guards raised their bows until Sir Harold ordered the gate opened. The stranger barely remained mounted long enough to cross the threshold before collapsing into waiting arms. He wore the livery of House Rosby. His face was gray with fatigue. "There is another fire," he gasped between ragged breaths, "south of the Blackwater, the village of Ashbrook." He coughed violently before forcing himself onward. "It still stands, for now, but wagons have vanished. Men disappeared in the night. My lord sent me to King's Landing." His eyes found the white cloaks. "He said if the king's men were already abroad, tell them they're too late unless they ride now." Master Clay spread the recovered map across a nearby barrel. Inekrik. Ashbrook was not marked. He frowned. It wasn't one of the 6. "No," Sir Harold agreed. "Which means the plan has changed." Tom studied the messenger's horse instead of the map. Mud clung to its legs almost to the knees, and fresh burrs tangled its mane. He came through marshland instead of the road. He looked toward the rider. "Why?" The messenger blinked in confusion. "The bridge," he answered. "It was blocked." "By whom?" "I never saw them. Trees had been felled across the road before dawn." Tom exchanged a long look with Harold. "They're hurting us." Within the hour, the company rode once more, leaving Brindle Heath behind under the protection of its own villagers. Captain Edric promised to keep armed watches until royal soldiers could arrive from Rosby, while Mara pressed food and blankets upon the travelers. Despite their protests, children waved uncertainly from behind the palisade as the riders departed. None smiled. The sight of green fire beneath their own streets had stolen something from every face in the village. The road toward Ashbrook crossed low country, where streams wandered through broad meadows before joining the Blackwater rush. Winter reeds whispered in the breeze, and flocks of wild geese lifted into the pale sky as the company approached. The land appeared peaceful, almost painfully so after the horrors of recent days. Yet Tom remained uneasy. Several times he left the road to inspect wagon ruts disappearing into the marshes. Each time he returned with the same troubled expression. "Supply wagons," he said after the third inspection. "Grain?" Emond asked. Tom shook his head. "Too heavy." By late afternoon, they found one of those wagons. It lay overturned in a shallow ditch beside the road, one wheel shattered against a stone. The 2 draft horses had been cut free and taken. 4 bodies rested nearby beneath hastily thrown cloaks. They wore no armor beyond quilted jerkins, only the plain clothing of teamsters hired to move cargo between market towns. Sir Harold knelt beside the nearest corpse. The man's throat had been cut cleanly. No signs of struggle marked the ground. "They surrendered," Harold said. Tom walked to the wagon. Most of its cargo had already been removed. Only one cracked barrel remained trapped beneath the broken axle. The tracker struck the wood gently with the back of his knife. It answered with a hollow sound. Maester Clay hurried forward. Together they pried away the damaged lid. The barrel appeared full of coarse salt. Tom plunged his arm deep inside. His fingers struck clay. One by one, he lifted out small sealed jars concealed beneath the upper layer of salt. Wildfire. Again. Enough to destroy another village. Eamon stared silently at the hidden cargo. Each discovery made the conspiracy seem larger than before. This was no handful of assassins moving through forgotten woods. Someone commanded wagons, forged records, bribed officials, and transported the deadliest substance in the realm beneath ordinary trade goods. Such work demanded wealth beyond common criminals and influence beyond wandering sellswords. Meister Clay broke the silence. These shipments began months ago. Yes, Sir Harold replied. And no one noticed. Harold looked toward the distant towers of King's Landing, barely visible through the evening haze far to the south. Or someone noticed, he said quietly, and chose not to speak. The company destroyed the remaining jars before continuing, burying the smoldering residue beneath wet earth carried from the marsh. The task consumed precious daylight, but none dared leave Wildfire for others to recover. By the time they reached the first farms belonging to Ashbrook, dusk had settled over the countryside. Smoke drifted above the rooftops. Not black smoke. Gray, cooking fires. The village still lived. For now. Then a bell began ringing. Not the slow, measured toll of evening prayer. A frantic alarm before the first echo faded. Another bell answered from farther away. Then another. Across the fields, riders burst from behind a line of trees. Not for this time. Dozens. All wearing plain cloaks that concealed whatever colors lay beneath. They did not charge the village. They rode straight toward the king's company. The riders spread across the fields with practiced precision, their line widening until it stretched from one hedgerow to the next. They carried no banners to betray their allegiance, only plain cloaks snapping behind them in the evening wind. As they drew nearer, Eamon saw that every horse was fresh and every saddle well kept. These were not desperate outlaws driven by hunger. They rode like trained men who had drilled together for years, holding their spacing without a shouted command. The realization settled heavily upon him. Someone had spent a great deal of gold preparing this moment. Sir Harold wasted none of the few heartbeats left to him. "Wheel left," he commanded. "Keep the prince in the center. Spears forward." The little company obeyed as one, turning away from the open road toward a low ridge crowned with wind-bent elms. The ground there narrowed between two marshy hollows, forcing any larger force to attack through a confined approach. Tom Rivers nodded once as he understood the choice. "Good ground," he muttered. "Not good enough, but better than dying in the open." The first arrows fell before either side reached the ridge. They hissed low through the cold air, striking shields with heavy thuds and burying themselves in the damp earth. One horse screamed as an arrow bit into its flank, throwing its rider into the grass before galloping wildly toward the marsh. Sir Harold did not look back. "Hold," he shouted. "Make them climb." His voice carried across the ridge even as more shafts rattled against wood and steel. Eamon crouched behind his shield, hearing every impact as though someone struck directly against his ribs. When the attackers reached the slope, the battle changed in an instant. Horses lost their speed climbing the muddy rise, and the king's men met them with level spears. The first rider toppled backward As his mount reared beneath him, another crashed into a fallen companion, bringing 3 more tumbling together in a confusion of hooves and broken harness. Sir Harold stepped into the opening with astonishing calm, his sword flashing once, then again. Every stroke carried the certainty of long discipline. He did not waste motion. Men simply fell wherever his blade passed. Emond found himself face to face with an attacker scarcely older than 20. The rider abandoned his horse after it stumbled and came uphill with a long sword held in both hands. Fear threatened to seize the prince, but years of training answered before panic could. Steel met steel with a ringing crack that jarred his arms to the shoulder. The young man pressed, hard, stronger than Emond had expected, driving him backward through wet grass. For one terrible moment, the prince felt himself losing balance. Then he remembered Sir Crispin's endless lessons in the yard. Step aside, not back. He shifted at the last instant. The attacker's momentum carried him past. Emond struck awkwardly rather than cleanly, the edge of his blade biting into the man's thigh. The stranger cried out and collapsed to one knee. Before Emond could recover his stance, the wounded man threw down his sword and reached inside his cloak. "Don't!" Tom shouted. The warning came too late. The attacker produced not another weapon but a small clay sphere. Tom's arrow reached him first, driving through his shoulder just as he hurled the object toward the defenders. The sphere shattered harmlessly against a rock several yards away. Thick, black liquid splashed across the stone but did not ignite. Maester Clay turned pale. "Wildfire," he breathed. "No," Tom answered grimly. "Only the oil that carries it." The battle surged around them. More riders abandoned their horses to fight on foot, while others circled the ridge, searching for weaker ground. One soldier of the Red Keep fell with an arrow through his neck, collapsing without a sound into the trampled grass. Another fought on despite a broken shield, using its splintered rim to knock an opponent from the slope before finishing him with a thrust beneath the ribs. Mud, blood, and rainwater mixed beneath every step until the hillside became slick as river clay. Then a horn sounded. It came not from the attackers, but from Ashbrook itself. A second blast followed. Then the village gates opened. Armed men poured out. For one desperate heartbeat, Emond feared reinforcements had arrived for their enemies. Instead, the newcomers crashed into the attackers' exposed flank with axes, billhooks, and hunting spears. They were millers, smiths, shepherds, and farmers, led by a broad-shouldered knight in battered mail, bearing the red chevrons of House Rosby upon his surcoat. The sudden assault shattered the attackers' careful formation. Horses panicked. Riders shouted conflicting orders. What had begun as a disciplined encirclement dissolved into scattered pockets of fighting. Sir Harold seized the moment. Forward. The king's company charged downhill. The attackers broke. Some fled toward the marshes. Others attempted to regroup farther across the fields. Several never reached either destination. Within minutes, the battle was over. The surviving riders scattered into the growing darkness, abandoning dead comrades and wounded horses alike. No pursuit followed. Sir Harold watched them disappear with visible reluctance before lowering his sword. "Let them run,"
he said between heavy breaths. The living may lead us farther than the dead.
The knight who had led Ashbrook's defense removed his dented helm, revealing a weathered face crossed by an old scar from temple to jaw. Sir Roland Buckwell, he introduced himself after saluting the prince and the Lord Commander.
Lord Rosby sent me yesterday with 30 men after your messenger reached us. His eyes swept across the fallen attackers. Looks like we arrived just before the worst of it. You've earned the king's thanks, Sir Harold replied. Roland's expression remained troubled. I wish that were enough. He beckoned them toward the village. Ashbrook still stood untouched by fire, but every entrance had been fortified with overturned wagons and sharpened stakes. Archers watched from rooftops instead of towers, and frightened families crowded inside the stone sept, where thick walls offered the greatest protection. The smell of fear lingered everywhere, mingling with wood smoke and damp straw. Even the livestock had been driven into the central square, where they shifted uneasily beneath constant watch. Roland led the company into the manor house overlooking the village. There, upon a heavy oak table, rested something wrapped carefully in stained linen. The knight dismissed everyone except Sir Harold, Maester Clay, Tom, and Prince Aemond before unfolding the cloth. Inside lay a human hand. It had been severed cleanly above the wrist. Upon one finger gleamed a heavy gold ring, engraved with the crowned 7-pointed circlet they had now seen again and again. Roland spoke quietly. My scouts found it hanging from the old bridge this morning.
No one answered. The ring alone would have been enough to command attention. But there was something else. Burned into the flesh of the wrist itself, as though branded while the man yet lived, was the unmistakable shape of a 3-headed dragon. Maester Clay stared at it for a long time before finally lifting his eyes. This is no warning. His voice had become little more than a whisper. It is an invitation. Outside, another raven landed upon the manor roof. This one carried a small leather tube bound to its leg. The bird had flown not from the countryside, but from King's Landing. No one reached for the raven at once. It remained upon the edge of the manor roof, outside the open window, shifting its black claws against the weathered tiles, while its bright eyes watched the room below. The bird appeared utterly ordinary, yet everyone present understood that it carried words from the heart of the realm. Sir Harold stepped outside himself, rather than trusting another hand with the message. The raven offered little resistance as he untied the small leather tube from its leg. When he returned to the table, the severed hand still lay where it had been found, its branded flesh and golden ring casting a grim shadow over the gathering. The parchment inside bore the royal seal, but something immediately troubled Maester Clay. The wax was genuine, the impression was flawless, yet the strip of silk used to bind the message belonged to no color customarily kept by the royal rookery. Clay turned it between his fingers before carefully breaking the seal. Either this came through unusual hands, he murmured, or someone has become very skilled at imitation. Sir Harold unfolded the letter without a word. The order was brief. Return to King's Landing immediately. Destroy all recovered evidence. Question no further witnesses. Deliver Prince Aemon safely to the Red Keep. It bore King Viserys' name beneath the royal seal. Silence settled over the room. Aemon read the words over Harold's shoulder, then looked instinctively toward the Lord Commander. His father had never been a man who feared truth, however painful it proved. He preferred peace, sometimes to a fault, but he did not command loyal men to burn evidence without explanation. Even at his age, Aemon knew that much.
Sir Harold folded the letter slowly, his face revealing nothing beyond careful thought. "What do you believe?" the prince asked. Harold answered only after several long breaths. "I believe this seal is real." He placed the parchment upon the table beside the severed hand. Whether the command truly comes from the king is another matter. Maester Clay nodded gravely. The seal could have been pressed days ago. The parchment itself is fresh. He leaned closer, studying the ink beneath the candlelight and the handwriting. He paused, narrowing his eyes. "Very good, almost perfect, almost." He touched the final flourish beneath the king's name. His grace never finishes this stroke upward. His hand has grown too stiff these past years. The maester looked up slowly. Someone copied the king's writing from older letters. Tom Rivers had wandered to the narrow window overlooking the village. His attention rested not upon the message, but upon the road leading south. "Then they know we found something worth hiding." He glanced back toward the table. "First they tried to kill us, now they try to turn us around." His weathered face hardened. "That means we're finally close." Sir Roland Buckwell spread another map across the table, this one showing the roads between Ashbrook, Rosby, and King's Landing. His finger stopped beside an old hunting lodge deep within the Kingswood. "3 of my scouts vanished near this place over the past month." He spoke quietly, ashamed that he had dismissed the disappearances as common banditry. "One horse returned without its rider. Another came back with fresh shoes from the Royal Forge." He tapped the map once. "No lord claims the lodge anymore. It has stood empty since my grandfather's day." Tom leaned over the map. "Not empty?" "No," Roland agreed. "Occupied." The decision came before dawn. Sir Harold divided the company for the first time since leaving King's Landing. Sir Roland remained behind with most of his own men to defend Ashbrook, while the Lord Commander selected only 8 riders to accompany him into the Kingswood. Fewer men meant quieter travel. Quieter travel offered a better chance of reaching the lodge unseen. Aemon expected to be ordered to remain in the village, yet Harold surprised him. "You stay with us?" The prince blinked. "I thought you would send me back." Harold fastened the straps of his gauntlet before answering. "Whoever commands this conspiracy has already shown too much interest in your safety." His eyes met Aemon's. "Until we understand why. You are safer where I can see you." The Kingswood greeted them with towering oaks older than the conquest itself. Moss-covered fallen trunks thick as castle walls, and narrow game trails wound through fern-covered hollows where sunlight rarely reached the ground. The deeper they rode, the quieter the forest became. Tom Rivers seldom needed to dismount now. Broken branches, trimmed brush, and faint wheel ruts told him enough. "Wagons," he whispered more than once. "Heavy ones, coming and going for months. I've found fresh horse dung, hidden beneath leaves, ashes buried in shallow pits, and rope fibers caught upon thorn bushes." The forest had become a road for men who wished no road to exist. Near midday, they discovered the first body. A young forester lay
concealed beneath evergreen boughs, scarcely 20 yards from the trail. His green cloak had been wrapped carefully around him, almost respectfully, but the arrow through his back left little doubt about how he had died. Tom recognized the man's belt knife immediately. "King's gamekeeper," he said. "I've seen this mark before." Burned into the leather sheath was the crowned stag used by the royal huntsman. "He found them," Sir Harold said. "And they found him. They buried the forester where they found him, marking the grave with stacked stones." No one spoke during the work. The dead man's presence answered an important question. The conspirators had not merely hidden themselves in forgotten woodland, they had been killing the king's own servants to protect their secrecy. Whatever waited ahead had already crossed beyond treason into open war against the crown. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin. Through the branches appeared the crumbling outline of the abandoned hunting lodge. Ivy climbed its stone walls, and one corner of the roof had collapsed years before. From a distance, it looked deserted, exactly as Sir Roland had described. Even the windows were dark. Tom studied it for several moments before quietly shaking his head. "Too clean." "What do you mean?" Aemond asked. "No birds nesting beneath the eaves?" Tom pointed toward the roof line. "No fallen branches across the path. Someone clears them away." He looked lower, where faint wisps of smoke drifted almost invisibly from behind the ruined chimney before dissolving into the afternoon air. "And someone still keeps a fire." Sir Harold motioned everyone into the trees. They left the horses concealed among dense brush and continued on foot. Each step carried them closer. The lodge remained silent. No voices escaped its walls. No guards stood at the entrance. Only when they reached the broken outer wall did Tom raise a warning hand. He had found fresh footprints, many of them, not leading into the lodge, leading down, hidden beneath tangled ivy at the rear of the old building where broken masonry concealed the opening. A wide stone stair descended into darkness beneath the earth. A cool draft drifted upward, carrying the unmistakable smell of lamp oil, hot iron, and wildfire. Far below, barely audible through the stone, came the rhythmic sound of hammers striking metal. The same sound they had first heard beside the ashes of Harlaw's Bend. Only now it was louder, and there were many hammers instead of one. The sound of the hammers rose steadily through the stone stair, each blow measured and deliberate, echoing beneath the abandoned lodge like the beating of a monstrous heart. Sir Harold lifted one hand, and the little company descended without a word. Moisture clung to the ancient steps, making every foothold uncertain, while the air grew warmer with each turn of the passage. The smell of lamp oil thickened until it nearly smothered the fresher scent of damp earth. Aemond's hand rested tightly upon the hilt of his sword. Somewhere below, men were working with enough confidence to believe no one would ever find them. The stair opened into a cavern so vast that the first lantern scarcely revealed its limits. Rough stone pillars supported the ceiling where miners had carved long galleries generations before, perhaps in the days before the dragons crossed the narrow sea. Wooden scaffolds crisscrossed the chamber, and scores of barrels stood stacked in orderly rows beneath heavy canvas sheets. Smiths labored beside portable forges,
fitting iron bands around clay jars while scribes recorded numbers upon wax tablets. Wagons waited near a broad tunnel leading deeper underground, already loaded with crates marked as grain, salt, lamp oil, and timber. Every false shipment they had uncovered across the Crown Lands had begun here. No one had yet noticed them. Sir Harold counted quickly. Nearly 50 men, some armored, others dressed as laborers, enough to overwhelm the king's little company if battle began in the open. Tom Rivers crouched behind a broken pillar, studying the cavern with narrowed eyes. "Look there," he whispered. Near the center of the underground hall stood a raised wooden platform. Upon it rested the remaining shipping ledgers, dozens of rolled maps, and a great table covered with markers representing villages, roads, and castles throughout the Crown Lands. Beside the table hung banners, still wrapped in plain cloth. One careless servant had allowed a corner to slip free. Beneath the covering gleamed the crimson scales of the three-headed dragon. "They meant to blame House Targaryen," Aemond breathed. "Yes," Maester Clay answered. "And more than that." His gaze had settled upon another object resting beside the maps. The brass lock that matched the key recovered from Brindle Heath. Sir Harold nodded once. "That table." Tom slipped away without another word. Keeping low behind crates and stacked barrels, he disappeared into the maze of supplies while the others remained hidden among the shadows. Minutes passed. The hammers continued their relentless rhythm. Men laughed. Teamsters argued over mule harnesses. None imagined death had already entered their sanctuary. Then, almost silently, Tom returned. "The key fits," he whispered. "What did you find?" A chest beneath the platform. His face had grown harder than Aemond had ever seen it. "Letters?" Sir Harold did not hesitate. "We take them?" Everything happened at once. A laborer turned unexpectedly and saw movement where none should have been. His startled shout echoed across the cavern before anyone could silence him. Hammers fell still. Soldiers reached for swords. Sir Harold drew his blade and charged directly toward the central platform before panic could become organized resistance. "For the king!" His cry rang through the cavern. The little company burst from concealment. Tom reached the platform first, seizing the locked chest, while Maester Clay gathered every loose parchment his arms could carry. Aemond found himself fighting beside the Lord Commander in a narrow passage between stacked barrels. Steel clashed in the confined space, sparks flying with every blow. The prince no longer fought as an eager boy chasing glory. Every strike served only one purpose: to keep his companions alive. The defenders recovered quickly. Crossbowmen climbed the scaffolds. Someone shouted for the wildfire. A man carrying a lit torch sprinted toward the nearest row of clay jars. Tom saw him. Without pausing, he snatched a throwing axe from a fallen guard and hurled it across the cavern. The blade struck the torchbearer squarely between the shoulders. The burning brand slipped from dying fingers. It landed upon bare stone, not the jars. A breath later, another conspirator kicked the torch forward. The flame rolled beneath a wagon loaded with sealed clay vessels. Maester Clay cried out in horror. "We have to leave." Sir Harold looked once toward the spreading fire, then toward the rows of barrels stretching into darkness. He understood before anyone spoke.
There was no saving the cavern, only preventing its contents from reaching the world above. "Run!" The order echoed through the mine. Tom threw the heavy chest into Eamon's arms. "Take it." The prince staggered beneath its weight, but held fast. Behind them, green fire blossomed beneath the first wagon. The explosion hurled shattered timber across the cavern. A second blast answered, then a third. Wildfire raced from barrel to barrel with terrifying speed, each eruption larger than the last. Men fled, screaming through galleries already collapsing beneath the force of the detonations. Scaffolds toppled into rivers of emerald flame. Stone pillars cracked. The ceiling itself groaned as centuries of weight shifted overhead. Sir Harold forced Eamon toward the stair. "Move." The company climbed through choking smoke, while the mountain seemed to tear itself apart beneath their feet. Dust poured down the narrow passage. More than once the prince stumbled beneath the weight of the chest, only to feel Tom seize his shoulder and drag him onward. Behind them, the explosions merged into one endless roar. Heat rolled upward so fiercely that the stone steps burned through leather boots. They burst from the hidden entrance seconds before the earth collapsed. The abandoned hunting lodge vanished in a deafening thunder of falling stone. Trees shuddered. The hillside split open. A column of emerald fire erupted through the ruins before sinking beneath an avalanche of shattered rock and black smoke. The blast threw every survivor to the ground. For a long while, none of them moved. When at last the silence returned, the lodge was gone. So were the mine, the workshops, the wildfire. The conspiracy's hidden heart had been buried beneath thousands of tons of earth. Only then did Sir Harold look toward the chest still clutched against Eamon's breast. "Open it." "Nay." The brass key turned smoothly. Inside lay bundles of letters wrapped in oilcloth, payment records bearing noble seals, and lists of names written in careful hands. Several belonged to merchants already known to the crown. Others belonged to officers serving within King's Landing itself. At the very bottom rested a single folded parchment written in a hand none of them recognized. It contained only one sentence. "When dragon turns upon dragon, the realm will already be burning." No signature followed. No explanation. Only those words. Weeks later, the company returned to the Red Keep. King Viserys received them privately, listening without interruption as Sir Harold laid the recovered letters before the Iron Throne. Arrests followed before sunset. Merchants disappeared into the black cells. Royal officials were seized from their own chambers. Hidden caches of wildfire were uncovered throughout the city before they could be moved elsewhere. Yet many names mentioned in the letters belonged to men already dead beneath the collapsed mine, while others had vanished beyond the narrow sea before the king's justice reached them. The conspiracy had been broken, but not every hand behind it had been found. As Aemond left the throne room that evening, he paused before a window overlooking King's Landing. The setting sun painted the city in shades of crimson and gold, and beyond the rooftops the dragons circled high above the black water, majestic and terrible beneath the fading light. He remembered the villages reduced to ash, the frightened faces of common folk, the branded hand, the hidden mine, and the men who had been willing to burn an entire realm in pursuit of power.
He was no longer the boy who had ridden out hoping to earn glory. Far below, smoke drifted peacefully from 1,000 chimneys. For the moment, the realm endured. But Aemond could not forget the final letter resting now in the king's hands, nor the dreadful truth hidden within it. The fire had been stopped. The hatred had not. Years later, when dragons truly turned upon dragons and the skies above Westeros burned with civil war, there were still old men in the Crown Lands who remembered the villages that had become ash before the dance had ever begun. They would shake their heads beside winter hearths and tell their grandchildren that the warning had come long before. The first dragon fought another. Few believed them. Fewer still remembered the names of those who had died to uncover the truth. Only one saying remained: the Targaryens. And everything will turn to ash. If you walk through the histories of Westeros long enough, you begin to see that kingdoms rarely perish because dragons breathe fire upon them. More often they are weakened by quieter flames long before the first castle burns. A forged letter, a hidden bargain, a frightened man who chooses silence instead of truth. These are the sparks that gather beneath the floorboards while lords celebrate victories and kings dream of peace. Power is seldom stolen in a single stroke. It is carried away piece by piece by those who believe no one is watching. When the blaze finally comes, people remember the fire, but they forget the hands that patiently laid the wood. You have seen that the greatest danger was never the wildfire itself. Wildfire was only a weapon, as dragons are only weapons in the hands of those who command them. The true battle was fought within the hearts of men who believed the realm could be shaped through fear rather than duty. In George R. Martin's world, honor is neither perfect nor triumphant, yet it remains one of the few things capable of standing against ambition. Sir Harold could not save everyone. Tom Rivers could not erase every trail. Aemond could not remain innocent forever. Even so, each chose to carry a burden instead of laying it upon another. And sometimes that is the only victory the world allows. The Targaryens stand at the center of every age, not because they possess dragons, but because every hope and every resentment in the realm eventually turns toward them. Some see salvation in the blood of old Valyria. Others see only tyranny waiting to awaken. Both fears can exist together, and that is what makes the dynasty so dangerous and so tragic. A crown cannot command love, nor can dragons compel loyalty forever. The higher a house rises, the longer its shadow stretches across the lives of ordinary people who never asked to stand beneath it. Perhaps that is why the small folk matter so deeply in every tale. Those songs seldom remember their names. They are the first to lose their homes, the first to bury their children, and the last to be thanked when peace finally returns. Great lords speak of succession, justice, prophecy, and legacy. But farmers measure history differently. They remember whether the harvest failed, whether the roads remained safe, and whether smoke rose from their own chimney at dusk. In the end, the worth of a kingdom is not proven in the throne room. It is proven in the villages that survive another winter. When you leave this story behind, remember not the hidden mine or the conspirators buried beneath the earth, but the quiet truth they revealed. Every wall can be breached. Every oath can be broken. Every dynasty, no matter how ancient, depends upon ordinary men and women choosing each day to remain faithful when betrayal would be easier. That fragile choice is the unseen foundation beneath every castle in Westeros, and once it cracks, even dragons cannot hold the stones together. So the tale returns to where it began, with a lonely village beside a slow brown stream, where morning light falls gently across drifting ash, and the wind carries away the last gray traces of a fire that seemed to come from nowhere at all.